Hi folks. For those of you who weren't here a few weeks ago and we were talking about in our Why God series, it was, why God can I not feel your presence? And it was a really challenging thing to unpack. And as I dug and dug, I thought, this is really gold, and so is this, and so is this. And so today we're on to part 2, but I thought that we would have a quick look at what the last time was about. I promise I won't take 50 minutes to tell you about it again. Thanks, Lex. I've got a clock down here. It implies that I'm going to look at it. That's the dilemma. But I thought quickly, before I launch into today, that we would have a look at what the last time was about. And so if you didn't get to hear it, the cool thing about live streaming is that it's recorded. So you get to listen to my lovely voice twice if you'd like to go back and listen to it. But there's going to be a quick summary up on the screen. So Kath, the lovely Kath, is putting that up there. We get told not to glance at one of the screens because sometimes on the screen that gets shown, we look to the other side. Excellent. All right. So this idea of loving God and experiencing his presence, we unpacked that actually it's not cookie cutter. It's not the way that we may have grown up with, or that the church we go to even dictates, or what was made cool in the 70s or 80s. But we actually realised as unique images of God made in his image, that there are potentially stacks of different ways that we can experience God's presence. I'm really hesitant to use the word feel, because I think if we just trust our feelings or our emotions, then it will go awry. But that notion of experiencing God's presence, we looked at 9 different ways. And I'm not saying they're the only 9, but there's some really clear categories that come out of historical evidence of how the church has practiced, and even just in the personality types that people have. And so I came out, when I looked at it, I was very clearly the intellectual, which probably won't surprise you as we go through today as well. But I was really encouraged to hear that people go, actually, I think I'm the enthusiast as well as the naturalist. And there should be some definitions as well that we can pop up with those. So I love being outdoors and I experience God in his creation, but I love celebrating it. And I love clapping at church. I love singing the songs off key. I love that we get to bop with Dave as we do that. And there's others that go, we talked about, I kind of prefer to rock up to church 10 minutes late so then I don't have to sing. But we also looked at, even though we have our personal preferences, that we are called to come together and commune with God together, as well as in those preferences. So what I didn't get to refer to last time I talked about this is that a lot of this information comes from a book by a guy called Gary Thomas, and it's called The Sacred Pathways. So if you're interested in researching more about this kind of thing, I really encourage you to grab that book. It means that you can look into the one that you really connected with some more, and in that way. Brilliant. All right. When I talked last time, I said that if we just are limited to experiencing God in these, I want to call them theologically neutral ways. So they're not things that we're going to go out to bat that are solid biblical things. They're theologically neutral. We wouldn't necessarily disagree about them. We can say, that's your thing, that's my thing, but we don't need to argue about them. But one of the things that rested heavy on my heart as I looked into this was, I could just say to you, you're one of those 9 types, and you either connect with that and you're reassured, but it still doesn't necessarily make God suddenly appear. Doesn't make him very close just by realising the natural ways that you connect with God. And I think for me, what hit home about that is perhaps we need to look at our perception of good and bad, and look at our perception of what breaks our relationship with God, and therefore breaks our capacity to experience his presence. Now, we are wired as human beings to acknowledge good and bad. Just as infants, we know milk, good, hungry, bad. Cat. Purring cat, good. Scary cat, bad. They're sort of natural instinctual things that we that we learn. But then there's some things we need to be taught. Perhaps drink bottle good, toilet water bad. For some. And so then we start putting that good and bad layer over human actions or human interactions that we have. And even our pop culture develops that idea of good and bad. So if I said to you, and I'm looking for audience participation here, if I said to you, name me a superhero, what would you say? Wonder Woman? Excellent, I hear Wonder Woman. Spider-Man? Captain America? I'm not bold enough to say whether he's Marvel or DC. Which one? Marvel. I didn't want to get it wrong. Captain America, who else have we got?
That baby thing from Incredibles.
Jack? Yeah, I like it. Who else? I'm just getting an age range. No one said Superman yet. He's usually the first one that comes out. Superman, Batman, Arch, which one? Oh, golden star for him, Jesus, he said. So we can automatically name some superheroes, and Hollywood capitalises on that idea of good and bad, and that there's an evil character and a good character. Now, I will own that even within those superheroes, there's this wrestle with good and bad, that they have things that, so Batman had that alter ego character that wrestled with the past that he had, and was his desire to do good based on the evil that had happened and his revenge factor, or was it because he desired to do good? I'm well aware of that, but you can see in our thinking that is our idea of good and bad, or even mostly good and mostly bad. But the dilemma in our faith journeys is, if we bring this notion of good and bad, or mostly good and mostly bad, into our understanding of character and our actions and relationships, then we start making a list of things that we need to do in order to stay good enough, to stay in God's favour. And that's a really unhealthy place to be. So as I've looked into this idea of what breaks relationship with God and what stops us from being able to connect with him and experience him, I realised that the understanding that I grew up of what was sin, and we would go, sin is bad, sin is evil, actually needs to be dug into a little bit to explore this concept. If I can't experience the presence of God because I'm not good enough, and I think that God's holding out on me, then I'm not having that deeper understanding of what sin is. Here's my hope for today. That with greater understanding of what hinders connection with God, there will be more opportunity for you to restore connection with him. Let me say that again. Greater understanding of what hinders connection with God will lead to a greater ability to restore connection with him. We're going to look at 3 words today. 3 words that start to unpack this idea of sin. Now, it's going to be a little bit confusing because sin is actually one of the words. We use sin as a blanket term to mean bad stuff or not of God stuff. But I want to use sin and 2 other words to start to describe what is it that breaks that connection with God. And so I thought I'd keep our little theme of circles going. And these are the 3 things we're going to look at today. We're going to look at sin as a concept of missing the mark. And so I hope that you can see the picture has the arrow and all the attempts at shooting the bullseye and the arrow missing that mark of the bullseye or even the target completely. Then the next one, iniquity and transgression as well, are not words that we commonly use in our vernacular, in our vocabulary. But this idea of iniquity is distorting the truth. Now, the picture I've got up there is of a man and a woman bending over, that idea of a crooked back or a crooked person, but you could also think of it as a crooked road, something that distorts or takes us off the path. And then transgression, probably a word we know a little bit better than iniquity. Transgression is the idea of breaking trust. And you can see there's 2 hands that have broken apart or have got a split in them. So when we explore these 3 things, and I'll explain the meaning of them, and we look at perhaps some examples in the Old Testament of where that word is used in a different context to help us understand it, we'll start to realise how it connects with our relationship with God and understanding his presence. Let's hook into the first one. This first word is called kata, or my Dutchness really likes this word because you're meant to pronounce it chata. And my Stork is of Dutch background, but my maiden name was de Goya, if you say it in Australian, or de Goya. So I like the chata of this one. If that's all you remember today, you'll remember chata. This one, chata, means missing the mark, and here's a couple of references of where it gets used. Actually, no, first I'd like to give you an example. So, missing the mark. You're going to see a picture of me up on the screen now. We have an activity at Camp Coolmatong called combat archery. It is the most therapeutic activity you can do because you get to put a mask on, get a bow and an arrow and fire them at the opposition. Many, many teachers like to do this. Wondering why? They get to fire arrows at their children. All in good fun. Now, it doesn't hurt. I've had someone fire at 5 metres away to my face with the mask on inside our office at work, just for quality control purposes. I might have closed my eyes, but it didn't hurt. The idea is that this is just a picture from the first time we played it. So the tyres are rugged. We have them all nicely painted now. And in fact, we did, in our intern training that we do at the start of the year, we did a session in order to show them what the activity is and how it runs. And so intern training happens in the school holidays, which means my kids are still at home. And so one form of babysitting is they actually got involved this year, the 3 of them, in order to do the activity. So we had Ali, Archer and Jazz in the activity. And I must say I was a little hesitant because the time that they'd played before, they'd played with all adults, namely my brother and my father, who were unable to potentially regulate the strength with which they fired the arrows at 7 and 8-year-old children. So I was hoping that perhaps the interns and the staff might have that regulation a little bit more. And I was also very cunning. We play an activity in this called Protect the President. Very American, I know. Protect the President, where one person from each side doesn't have a bow and arrow. They wear a vest, and the rest of their team has to protect them from getting hit. Now, I thought I'll put Ali on one end and Archer on the other. They'll be the presidents. They've got an old life jacket on, so they've got all this padding, so it'll be a safer option if the adults in the game decide to fire full pelt. All really good, except Ali, bless her cotton socks, didn't understand the concept of what it meant to protect the president. So her team had come up with an excellent tactic of her going behind the largest adult and that adult protecting and had a very good shot. But Ali, I love you, honey. I'm just going to stand here. Says the adult and runs in front of her. I'm going to stand here. Needless to say, Ali was a very easy mark, and her team lost within the first 2 minutes of that activity. So you can see that idea of missing the mark or hitting the mark, that idea of kata, is very easily demonstrated in that activity of what it means. There's a couple of examples like that in the Old Testament where it talks about, in Judges 20, there's a story told about the Israelites and a people coming together and in battle. And one of them, it says, among all those were 700 chosen men, and everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not kata, not miss. The accuracy is that good with this concept. Or in Proverbs 19, verse 2, it says, desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste khatas his way, misses his way, loses direction. So when it comes to connecting with God or experiencing his presence, we can ask, what is our goal? If we're missing the mark in sin, what is the mark? What is the destination? How do we not sin? How do we not khata? Well, right at the beginning of the Bible, we learn that every human is an image of God, a sacred being who represents our Creator and is worthy of respect. God created all of creation and then mankind, man and woman, and said it is very good, the pinnacle of his creation. And so with this lens of our value and our worth, sin or khata or missing the mark is failing to love God and others by not treating them with the honour they deserve. So to sin is to not love God and love others as ourselves. And obviously, this idea comes through famously in the code of conduct that the Israelites get, the 10 Commandments. 5 of them about how to love God, 5 of them about how to love others, and they're married together in that way. And yes, the Israelites don't hit the mark. And almost you could say they were set up to fail. And the fact that both kinds of this failure, not loving God and not loving others, shows that failing to honour and love God is actually deeply connected with failing to honour and love people. Let's have a look at a conversation that Jesus had with the Pharisees in the New Testament. I'm going to read it out. It comes from one of the Gospels because I didn't write down where it comes from. When the Pharisees heard how he had bested the Sadducees, this is the Message version, I really like this version, they gathered their forces for an assault. One of their religion scholars spoke for them, posing a question they hoped would show Jesus up. Teacher, which command in God's law is the most important? Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence. This is the most important, the first on any list, but there is a second alongside it. Love others as well as you love yourself. These 2 commands are pegs. Everything in God's law and the prophets hangs from them. And so when we're missing the mark with this greatest goal of loving God and others, obviously we're going to be less aware of God. The power of sin or missing the mark in us explains how easily we deceive ourselves, yeah? And we spin the truth. We spin illusions to redefine how our bad decisions really were good ones. It thwarts our ability to judge whether we're succeeding or failing at loving others and loving God. And I know that we're no longer slaves to sin because of what Jesus has done on the cross, but there still remains that deep selfishness inside us that drives much of our behaviour. Yeah? It's not a pretty picture, but to be honest, it's realistic. So, this is why in the Bible, the story of Jesus is such good news. He's depicted as the Creator becoming a truly human one who didn't fail to love God and others. He did not sin. And yet he took the responsibility for humans' history of missing the mark. He lived for others and he died for their sins. He was raised from the dead to offer them the gift of his life that covers for our own incapacity to meet the goal of loving others and loving God. It's not a Jesus died on the cross and now he leaves the rest up to us. And there's a verse that says he died once for all. Doesn't mean that he died once and that was it and we have to do the rest. Don't mistake that. He committed no sin, yet he carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to our sins and live to do what is right. Let's move on to iniquity or distorting the truth. Now I have a joke. I'm not sure if it's as funny as Joel's. You'll have to listen for the delivery, yeah? It's my second favourite joke after my pirate joke, which I won't tell again because my children will groan. There's 3 old codgers all sitting on a chair on a park bench. I'm painting a picture. I liked how Joel painted a picture. 3 old guys sitting on a bench. And the first one goes, "It's windy, eh?" The guy next to him says, "Nah, it's Thursday." The next guy says, "Yeah, me too. Let's go and get a drink." Thanks. I think I got more laughs than you, Joel. Slightly. No. I'm not giving you the microphone. Anyway, that idea of what the guys were saying was getting distorted purely by their own deafness, but it kind of highlights that idea of things get distorted when we have our own mindset of what we think is going on, yeah? This word iniquity is translated as avon in the Bible. Sometimes the verb of it is called avar, or so if I've avarred or someone avars, they are displaying iniquity. And in the New Testament, because avon is Hebrew, in the New Testament, the word for that is anomia. And I'm like, if you say it with enough confidence, that's how it sounds. So we're looking at this concept of avon, this distorting the truth, this crookedness either of ourselves or the direction that we go that separates us from the presence of God or experiencing the presence of God. I correct myself. In Job 33, there's a big long speech in chapter 33 from one of his three friends, which were highly critical. This friend says, and he's sort of speaking in the authority of God, I guess, I have sinned, I have avarred, which means distorted or perverted what is right, but I did not get what I deserved. In Jeremiah, there's this cry. A cry is heard on the barren heights, the weeping and pleading of the people of Israel, because they have avarred, perverted or distorted their ways and have forgotten the Lord their God. In Psalm 32, verse 5, interestingly, avon is not just about the action of sinning, if we use that big overarching term, but it actually describes the consequences that come out of what we're doing. So the avon is the crooked consequences. And we know that when we distort the truth, it has an ongoing effect. It doesn't just stick with ourselves and our own separation from God, it affects others. And so it's in Psalm 32, it says, I did not hide my avon, my crookedness, but I confessed it, and you carried the avon, the crooked consequences of my sin. That's big stuff. In the Bible, avon refers to all types of crooked behaviour, probably some we could easily list off. Look at the 10 Commandments, lying, murder, adultery, all crooked, twisted behaviour. But my guess is none of us in here have been a murderer. So what does this idea of crookedness look like in our own hearts, in our own behaviour? Our distortion of what is true can be subtle at first and creep up over time, the same way an old woman or man don't go from this to this, but it slowly creeps to that distortion of crookedness until you don't remember what it was to be straight. It's behaviour that we justify a little and a little and a little more that bears a consequence for not only ourselves but of others. Let's check a couple of interactions that Jesus had in the New Testament. Now, Jesus, I will say it again and again, he fascinates me. And so I love to look at what went on when he was on earth. We look at the rich young ruler. You may know this story, and I'll read it. Someone came to Jesus and said, Teacher, what good thing shall I do so that I may obtain eternal life? And Jesus said to him, why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one who is good, but if you want to enter life, keep the commandments. And then he said to him, the rich young ruler said to Jesus, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, honour your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbour as yourself. And the young man said, do you remember? I've done all that. I've kept these. What am I still lacking? This young ruler knew that something wasn't right. Jesus said to him, if you want to be complete, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. But when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. Now hear me right. I'm not saying distortion of the truth is having a lot of money. But I wonder, in thinking about this concept, whether it wasn't the money or the property that was the issue for this young man, but that Jesus knew the heart of him and knew that he'd started to distort the truth such that love of money had started to twist what he thought was most valuable and most worth striving after. And so the question I ask is, what is it that we are starting to distort and twist that has varied us from what the truth actually is? Another interaction that Jesus had with two of the disciples, James and John. I love how honest these disciples are and the interactions of it. Then James and John came to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." Bold move. "Well, what do you want from me?" Jesus asks. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and one of us sit at your left in your glory." I don't know what discussion they had before this to think that let's ask Jesus this. Yeah. "You do not know what you're asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. "No idea." Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they've been prepared." And then he goes on to talk about how those who want to be the most need to be the least, and looking at the Son of Man came to serve and not be served. But what twist of truth went on in their head to make them think this is a really good question to ask Jesus or a request to have of him? They had been around Jesus, they'd known his teaching, but things had started to skew. So perhaps for us, our avon, our crookedness, our distorted truth happens when we start to justify being angry at somebody, our partner or our kids or our work colleagues. When we start to cut corners in business, figuring that it's okay to beat the system. When we don't catch our incorrect thinking as we judge others or judge ourselves based on others. Or when we start to believe that we deserve something more than someone else because of how hard we've worked or what we've put into something. And so then the crooked consequences start to occur. Broken relationship with people, bitterness, deceit, self-pity, lying to ourselves and others. It's so simple, but it's so hard to recognise and confess this iniquity, this avar, and asking God to reveal it to us. But again, the story of Jesus is such good news. Our great God and Saviour, Jesus the Messiah, this is from Titus, gave his life on our behalf in order to redeem us from all of our anomia, our crooked behaviour and its consequences. And then transgression, the breaking of trust. It's the pesha, or in the New Testament in Greek, the paraptoma. It can sometimes be translated as rebellion or trespassing as well. Let me give you an example from when I was 4, and I can't give you a photo. There's no photo evidence, but I know what happened in my heart. My mum made me the most awesome dressing gown. She was actually a really good sewer, and I think, to be honest, she did a lot of the sewing because it was cheaper. But I had this glorious dressing gown that went down to about here. This is pre-Uddies, right? And we were playing a game of Family Monopoly, and I really liked to be the banker. I think you know where this is going, because I used to get a bit bored with Monopoly because everyone took so long to take their turns. So I used to think if I could be the banker, then I had something to do, and I really enjoyed it. Well, I don't know what went on in my head one Sunday night, but I thought, well, I have this glorious dressing gown, and the cash till is right there. I could just steal some, and I wonder how well I can stick one under my dressing gown. And again, and I surmounted quite an amount of money under my dressing gown. And needless to say, my brothers and sisters never, ever, ever let me be the banker ever again. Not even the real estate agent where you hand people out those, because of the breaking of trust that I had with them. Now, I was reflecting on this in the car on the way, and I thought, well, why didn't they? Why wasn't there any forgiveness in that? And do you know what the reality is? I'd never asked for forgiveness. I just expected that they should get over themselves and let me be the banker again. Surely I was a couple of years older. Surely I was more trustworthy, but never again. Thankfully, my darling husband lets me be the banker on the few times that we play Monopoly. I'm very grateful. But that's just an idea of that breaking of trust. When we think that what we're doing is okay, or the ball starts rolling, and before we know it, we're doing something that we didn't expect to do, that actually breaks the trust of people that we love. There's a couple of Old Testament examples. In 2 Kings, a king dies, Ahab. And after that, Moab, one city, rebelled against Israel. That's that Peshad, or Pashad, I think it says in the verb tense. Pashad against Israel, broke trust after that king died. Or in Exodus chapter 22, we read about how it talks about if a man goes away and he gives all of his things for his neighbour to look after, if he gets robbed and it's not the neighbour, that's pretty bad. But if it's the neighbour that actually ends up robbing him in that process, that is a huge break of trust. And the consequence of that, Exodus tells us, is double-fold or two-fold what it would be if the robber was caught and actually had to give back what he had stolen. It was seen as so much more a bigger deal to break the trust as well as steal the contents. One of the stories that I find interesting in Jesus' interaction with his disciples as well is his interaction with Peter, where Jesus predicts that Peter will deny that he knows him 3 times before the cock crows. And Peter says, no, I would never deny you, Jesus. And yet we know that it happens. What goes on in Peter's mind in that process? Is it fear? Is it pride? Is it a mix of both? And yet Peter does it 3 times, not once, denies that he knows Jesus in order to not be lumped into that same category of you need to die. So the question needs to be asked, how and when is trust broken? What is our act of betrayal? Is it the sin of fear or pride when the boundaries of God no longer apply to us? When our free will causes us to step out of those healthy boundaries that God has given us. And it's then that we break the trust of others and we're transgressing. We are showing pesha. Unsurprisingly, the outcome is broken relationship. And yet again, the story of Jesus is such good news. In Romans, Paul writes this: if death came to all of us by the paraptoma, the breaking of trust of one human, how much more will God's gracious gift overflow to many by means of a human, Jesus the Messiah? And so, what does it mean to restore relationship with God in order to better glean his presence? I think it's the simplest and hardest thing all at once. Our biggest deception is that we can hide our sin, hide our iniquity, hide our transgressions from a holy creator God. Just like Adam and Eve's first instinct in the garden after they'd chosen to eat the fruit of the tree of good and evil was to hide from God. And I love that God walks through the garden and says, Adam, Eve, where are you? As if he has no idea. Just as that deception of themselves, that they could hide what they had done, is our own deception. We are called to love God and love others as we love ourselves with every fibre of our being. And because we are not yet made whole, we are saved and being saved at the same time. We will always fall short of this. Always fall short of this. But God already had a plan to redeem this, to redeem the shortcomings of us, of every man and woman that has gone before, with the death and the perfect man God, Jesus. So because of that, we continue to be redeemed. We rest in the presence of God in our own unique God-given way, when we seek to restore relationship with him. The story of Jesus is such good news every single day. When we seek forgiveness for the ways that we miss the mark with loving God and loving others and ourselves. When we seek forgiveness for the ways that we distort the truth through our actions, our self-perception and our perception of God. When we seek forgiveness for the ways that we break trust by not living within the healthy boundaries God's given us, and in putting our selfish desires ahead of the honour that we should bestow on all of creation. Now, it seems a little bit cliche, but when I was preparing this, the verse that came to mind was one that I had learnt as a child. I want to read to you part of Psalm 139. If I had the time, I would read it all, but I'm going to read the start and the finish. I pray that this resonates with you, that to experience the presence of God, we need to seek him out, ask forgiveness, not because he doesn't know what we've done, but because that's part of restoring that relationship with him so that we can experience the fullness in the ways that he's created us. Let me read Psalm 139. I invite you to close your eyes as you listen to this. O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me, and you place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. Amen.